In our republic, the voters decide the course of our nation, both domestically and abroad. And they have elected Donald J. Trump as our president when it comes to foreign policy on a very clear mission.
Earlier this week, newly confirmed Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke for the first time to employees of the State Department.
And that mission is to ensure that our foreign policy is centered on one thing, and that is the advancement of our national interest.
Rubio will be leading an agency that many people see as under threat. Trump himself has called it the Deep State Department. Even before his inauguration, scores of senior career diplomats were told by Trump aides they needed to resign. And there are expectations that how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world is about to change in a big way.
There will be changes, but the changes are not meant to be destructive. They're not meant to be punitive. They're not out of... The changes will be because we need to be a 21st century agency that can move by a cliche that's used by many at the speed of relevance.
Recently, hearing about all these changes coming for the federal workforce, I've been wondering, what do we think of when we think of a civil servant? What shapes our understanding of what these people do, why their jobs exist, and whether they're actually good for our country and for the world? Funny enough, one place where I've seen these questions raised is on TV, and a show on Netflix called The Diplomat.
You are not doing this to restore our reputation in the world.
Oh, this ought to be good. Why am I doing it?
You're scared your enemies think you're too old and frail to put Americans in the line of fire.
That's Carrie Russell, one of the stars of The Diplomat. The second season of the show came out late last year. Russell plays a no-nonsense Foreign Service officer who suddenly becomes a very unwilling ambassador to the UK, where she has to navigate this tangled web of foreign intrigue. To be clear, the show is completely fictional. I think it's safe to say that a lot of what happens in the show would never actually happen to a State Department employee. But the show has become one of my favorite things that I've watched in recent years. And to me, it captures something very interesting about this moment and how we imagine the people behind the scenes in our government. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Saturday, January 25th. And today, we're bringing you this bonus episode. An interview with the creator and executive producer of The Diplomat, Debora Cahn. I sat down with her in her office on the set of the show in New York to talk about the surprising appeal of the Foreign Service, the allure of quote-unquote competency porn, and what this show has to say in the Trump era. I want to start with hearing a little bit about how you came up with the concept for The Diplomat. And as I understand it, part of the origin story comes from when you were working on another show, Homeland, which is another very popular show about political intrigue around the world, and that you participated in something called Spy Camp.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about Spy Camp.
So Spy Camp was this great thing that would happen at the beginning of every season on Homeland. Homeland was based in LA, everybody was based in LA, and we would fly to Washington for 1 week. And one of our consultants would put together this week-long program of, we would sit in this great old townhouse in Georgetown. And the most incredible parade of experts would come through. It was a CIA show, so certainly people from the CIA, but policymakers, journalists, generals, and an ambassador, more than one. In fact, most of that show was about the war on terror, so we had a lot of people who had been, Foreign Service people who had been in Afghanistan or Iraq. And this woman named Beth Jones came in. She reminded me a lot of my Aunt Ruthie, who I love very much.
Wait, how so? Like, what was it? What was it about her that reminded you of your Aunt Ruthie?
She has a sort of a very sweet, proper-looking demeanor. She doesn't look like an action hero, but she is. And she came in and started talking about, what happens on an average Tuesday when she was working in, I believe it was Pakistan. And it just sounded like a James Bond story. I mean, it just, the number of things that she was juggling and managing as bombs were dropping, and she's trying to get over this pass so that she can set up a meeting with this warlord. It really did seem like a thriller.
Yeah.
And I felt like these were stories that I had not heard before. And there was something about the fact that it came from this very unassuming woman that made it even better.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, what was it about that conversation with her that made you realize that there's something to mine here in terms of diplomacy and what diplomats do, and that, like, this is a world that is ripe for tension and conflict and a TV show?
At the time, I had pretty small children, and the phrase "use your words" came up quite a lot in our house. Mm-hmm. And the idea that...
Use your words as in, like, don't hit each other.
As in, stop
you should
hitting
talk it
your
out.
baby brother. Just use your words and tell him how frustrated you are. So that idea, next to... I am never able to remember exactly who first said, when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that came up around the Iraq War. The idea that there was this whole other army of people who go out attempting to find solutions, create relationships, pave the way for peaceful resolution of conflict, either before something, explodes into violence or a war, or while it's happening, and how do you bring it to a conclusion. I felt like the stories that she was telling were things that I had never heard before. And the way that she did her work and her colleagues, she hooked me up with a lot of other people who had been ambassadors around the world. And the way that they work is sort of designed to disappear into the background.
Like, if they're doing their job right, you're not hearing about
You've
what
never
they're
heard of
doing.
it. Yeah.
So I want to talk about the main character of The Diplomat, and that is Ambassador Kate Weiler, played by Kerry Russell. And a little bit about her, she's a career diplomat who has spent much of her career navigating in these war-torn countries, places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And she comes into this new job as an ambassador in the UK, which she didn't really volunteer for and is told that she kind of has to do. And from the very beginning, she feels acutely this tension between some of the demands of this new job as an ambassador, things that she's a little bit dismissive of like, you sometimes have to put on a dress and look nice and show up to places and be photographed and host a lavish July 4th party at the ambassador's residence.
Oh, give them a f***ing break. They need a picture of you for the website.
On a horse?
It'll be great. They'll do before and after photos. First-time ambassador. You need to lean into the Cinderella thing.
I am not Cinderella. I'm here for 30 funerals. The only T-length garment I packed is a burqa. I have a black suit, and I have another black suit. And I'm not getting dressed by someone named Pippa so a women's magazine can ask who I'm wearing and what advice I have for little girls.
Because she's a person who wants to be doing real work and tackling real problems as she sees it. And so that's something that she is struggling with as she becomes more enmeshed in this job. But she's also someone who believes deeply in the power of diplomacy. And there's a scene from season 1 that I think really captures this, and I want to play a little bit of this tape here. So just to set things up, she is outside the ambassador's residence talking to the White House Chief of Staff, played by Nana Menza, and the CIA Chief of Staff in London, played by Ali Ahn. And there's this tense moment where Kate Weiler is airing her frustration with this new job.
You know why I don't want this job? I spent a decade building a reputation in a community such that when I say something, people f***ing listen to me. I have none of that here.
Not none.
Then they kind of go on to debate what they're going to do in this moment because they are weighing whether they should push this valuable source in Iran to give them more intel about something related to this attack on a British naval ship. And the chief of staff and the CIA official want to try to put pressure on him. But Ambassador Kate is adamant, no, we shouldn't, because that would damage this delicate relationship.
What we are really doing when we negotiate with them or with anyone is looking for one or two friends we can call when the world is truly f***ed. It is a flimsy web of relationships, but sometimes it holds. Do not tear it. Do not be an infinitely ravenous American.
So I'm curious, what drives Kate Weiler as a diplomat?
I think that she believes deeply in the goodness of the United States and its potential to be a force for good in the world and for itself, and sees so many moments where we're close to that and then we miss. And she feels like she understands that there are moments where if you're in the right place at the right time, creating the right relationship or facilitating the right conversation between two people who swore that they, would never shake hands, that you can actually make massive changes in the course of history, or at least you can make incremental steps forward in a direction of peace. She's seen that happen once or twice in her career, and once you've seen that it's possible, that's habit forming.
She's also someone who is really good at her job in many ways and is also kind of a mess in other ways.
Yes.
And some of that is kind of visual stuff, or there's a lot that's made over the course of the series about how her hair is like kind of always a little unkempt. She's always like staining her shirt or pants or whatever.
What did you have for lunch?
Yogurt.
You're wearing it.
Hi. You for a second.
But I felt like there's something very her character shares some DNA with other female protagonists of shows that you've worked on in the past. Like I'm thinking of Homeland, Carrie Mathison, who's exceptional in many ways and also a mess in her personal life. And you've also worked on Grey's Anatomy with Meredith Grey, someone who, again, is like marvelous and brilliant, and also that has a personal life that's a lot, I think, again, the word mess comes to mind, especially when you think about early seasons. Why do these kinds of female characters appeal to you, of people who are so good at the work that they do, even if they are struggling in other ways?
Some people watch the show and have told me that she's such a unique character and that it's really great to see this individual on TV. I think she's not unique at all. I think she's me and everybody that I know who gets out of bed and tries to pull it together to go out into the world and is 100% sure that they are obviously a disaster walking through space and everybody can see it. I think we all feel like that on the inside. So Kate is more visibly, at least to the audience, although also a little bit to the people around her, she's like on the outside how we feel on the inside. And it's striking to me, particularly in the kind of spaces that we're representing on the show. We're in castles, we're in palaces, we're in halls of government, but the dynamics of what's happening inside every individual's body in those spaces is the same as it is anywhere else. Like, if you have an itch on your foot in the middle of a meeting with the king, you still want to scratch your foot, and you're still spending much of the conversation trying to figure out when you can. So those dynamics just feel real to me, and for me, remind me all the time that these things that we believe are happening on some higher level aren't. It's just us in those rooms. It's people like us. I think I reached a certain age where I realized that I was one of the grown-ups in the room and I don't know anything. And now I'm one of the people in charge in a very small world, certainly not on the world stage, but that the people that I believed kind of held the rudder,
That they clearly knew what they were
they
doing.
knew, and they didn't feel like this. They had it together, and they would appropriately walk into those spaces. They knew how to do it. And at a certain point, you realize nobody's in charge, or the people who are in charge are as tragically, brutally human as you are.
Mm-hmm. Are there other ways that the character of Ambassador Weiler is either based off of you or qualities that kind of came from your own life?
Kate Weiler is so many different people. She's certainly inspired by a lot of political figures, a lot of ambassadors, a lot of people that the audience, your audience certainly is very familiar with. But then at the end of the day, when you're writing a show about relationships, you do tend to use what you know. So the horrific relationship between Kate and Hal is an epic, gross exaggeration of what goes on in my own home.
Horrific is a strong word, and I was going to ask you about that, like what you think we're supposed to make of the relationship between the two of them. But let me just give a little background here for folks who haven't yet watched the show. So in the show, Ambassador Weiler is married to another Ambassador Weiler, and that is her husband, Hal Weiler, who is played by the great Rufus Sewell.
Hello, everyone.
And welcome to you, Ambassador Weiler.
Call me Hal. One ambassador's plenty.
Perhaps Mr. Weiler. Please, follow me.
We're going to do this every time?
He is also a longtime State Department person, a former ambassador to Lebanon, and he is in many ways Kate's opposite. He has this big personality. He's this great public speaker. He's very charming. He can be the life of the party, which also kind of creates an interesting and sometimes negative dynamic between Kate and him. And in some ways they're allies, in some ways they're competitors, in some ways they're looking out for each other, in some ways they're really not. But then I have to come back to what you just said of like, in what ways do you see a little bit of that dynamic in your own life?
I see in my marriage and the marriages of the people that I'm close to, it was important to me to write about a marriage that was cracking or straining, not under the weight of infidelity, which is usually kind of the shorthand in film and television for why a marriage may be suffering.
That's kind of the stereotype. And there's even, it feels like in the show that it's at moments that it might be headed in that direction, but that it's, the conflict ultimately is not about that, which I found very surprising and almost refreshing.
Yeah, that was sort of the hope that we could, because I think the difference between a couple who's thriving and a relationship that's on the brink of divorce is like hair thin, and every single day, I think there are moments where people think, I can't go on like this anymore. And it isn't because somebody went and screwed somebody else. It's because of how they breathe or how they chew or all of these things, that these tiny irritations that are such a constant in your life. And the ability to stay in a relationship, I think, demands the ability to encounter moments of conflict that feel huge, that feel meaningful. Maybe they are and maybe they're not. But then being able to find some sort of resolution, as it were, a diplomatic solution that keeps the relationship moving forward, and that the feeling of I shouldn't be in this situation is not out of place in a marriage. And from my perspective, that's a piece of it. And you have to get used to the idea that there will be moments that feel like that, and that you can get to the other side of them.
That you don't give into the panic or the like, oh my God, what is going on here? How did I end up here? That those are just temporary feelings.
They are, and that they're a natural part of the process, and that you have to choose every day. You have to choose to be in this alliance, just as we do, looking at the US and the UK, who have had a partnership for 200 years, something. Almost 200 years?
Something like that.
And we've changed. They've changed. Is the partnership going to continue? I don't know. We don't know the answer that we'll have to the question 4 years from now. We think we do. We hope we do, but we don't really know. And you have to go into each point of conflict with the understanding that you do have a way to get out, but you don't necessarily want to use it.
I think another thing that I found that I think other folks found in some ways relatable about the Kate Hal relationship is that they're two very ambitious people. And in some ways, their shared ambition kind of brings them together. In other ways, it's working at cross purposes. But a lot of folks have brought up Bill and Hillary Clinton as either who they think Kate and Hal are based off of, or like the way that
relationship to that couple at all. Absolutely not.
Interesting, because it's, that it's like two people who are in the same world. The man is like the charming, big personality. The woman is like more detail-oriented, but knows how to get things done behind the scenes. I mean, you could argue that neither of those things are true, or a lot more complicated for Bill and Hillary Clinton. But that was not your source material.
It was
here?
Absolutely part of the source material. Absolutely, yes. Most definitely. But I know a lot of couples who met at work, fell in love at work. There's the passion that they have for each other, which is sort of wound up with the passion that they have for the work that they do. And there's a status relationship in those situations. Often it is a successful man, an up-and-coming woman. There's a little bit of an age difference there. They're at different points in their professional lives. And 10, 15 years into it, sometimes the status relationships have really flipped. And, one of the partners is sort of cruising down the backside of the mountain and somebody else has just hit the top of it. And some relationships can handle that change in professional status and some can't. So in much of my dating life, I was dating people who were in the fields that I was in. And so I think I look at it as the road not taken. I understand very much the appeal of it, but I also see the price that you pay to make that choice.
Interesting. After the break, we talk about my favorite character of this most recent season, the ambitious and complicated vice president played by the amazing Allison Janney. And we'll also hear from Debora Cahn about what she's thinking about as she makes this show under a new president. We'll be right back. I want to ask about one of what felt to me like the big surprises and the big excitements of season 2 of The Diplomat, which is that a politician shows up, and that is the Vice President of the United States. And what I think is so interesting about this character is that we've been hearing about the vice president since the very beginning of the show. And that's basically the reason why Ambassador Weiler, Kate, is in this job, because she's kind of being vetted to potentially be the next vice president, because this vice president, who's a woman, her husband embezzled some money, she's going to be pushed out soon. And they know that she's not long for this world, so they're preparing who's going to be the next VP. But the character is just sort of wallpaper for the first season, most of the second season. You never meet the character, you just hear about her, and she's kind of already a political has-been because we know that she's out the door. But then she shows up in the UK, and she is Allison Janney, the incredible Allison Janney. And to me, that was a moment where I was like, oh, this character is going to be something, because, Allison Janney is just so wonderful at what she does, and, that she's here for something meaty. What went into the decision to cast her as the vice president?
It all unfolded backwards. I'm not really sure if I should be embarrassed to say that or not, but we got Allison before we knew what the story was. Ginny Howe from Netflix came up with the idea to bring Allison onto the show. We reached out to her. She was willing to do it, which was just an absolute fantasy come true.
And it makes so much sense because of her experience as the character C.J. Craig from The West Wing, which so many people have very, very strong memories of.
Well, I've got a staff meeting to go to, and so do you. You elitist Harvard fascist missed the dean's list 2 semesters in a row, Yankee jackass.
Feel better getting that off your chest there, CJ?
I'm a whole new woman.
Yes, which was a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, I certainly knew that she was the master of this kind of material, but we also didn't want to bring CJ in the door. We wanted Allison to be able to create something completely new. And of course she did. I don't know what I was worried about even for a second. She absolutely did. But the Grace Penn story was sort of there. There are a bunch of things that Grace Penn is the vice president. So we planted this character in the very first episode, and we kept waiting for the right time to turn her into someone. And, you know, I think initially we thought that she was going to have a big role from the very beginning. And every time we started talking about the Grace Penn story, we were just more interested in the Kate story, which felt right. And so she kept getting kind of pushed back onto the back burner. And then when Allison showed up, it was like, oh, well, Grace Penn just got a lot more important.
And it's a very quick evolution over, you know, the episode where Ambassador Kate Weiler and Vice President Grace Penn where their relationship changes so much. Because at the beginning, the vice president shows up in London and Ambassador Weiler is very wary, and she recognizes the awkwardness here, that she's kind of in this job as ambassador to eventually take over for the vice president, but that, like, does the vice president know that, and how much are they going to talk about that? And they have a series of conversations over the course of this episode where they're spending time together that I just found fascinating, and I want to play some of the tape of those conversations here. Because at the very beginning, there's this moment where Grace basically confronts Kate and is like,
I hear you want to be vice president.
Oh.
I know a thing or two about the job if you have questions.
And there's this great line where she's like,
I wouldn't say I want to be vice president.
You wouldn't.
I think we'd all be happier if you stayed where you are. But I understand there is a problem, and I'm willing to step in.
So you would be vice president of the United States as a favor.
And she's just so, it's kind of scathing. And then she kind of goes on to basically tear into Kate in some ways, saying, look, you think that you are above thinking about your appearance and, playing the game of trying to be like the perfect politician, but that the fact that you don't care about your appearance is a problem for you, and like you need to address that. And she just kind of lights into her with detail after detail about the ways that she's falling short.
Looking to the north, you probably think your hair says you're too busy serving your country to get a blowout, but it reads as bedhead, which sends a signal I think in this case is better unsent. East and west, try a bra with a little padding. I know there's not much to hide, but when your jacket opens, I'm getting headlights, which takes us to the south. Is that a paperclip?
Oh, yes, I had a zipper issue.
When you're a second-tier diplomat in a third world war zone, that may read as scrappy. If you're representing the interests of 300 million Americans whose healthcare is failing, whose planet is burning, whose future might get a little bit better or a little bit worse based on what you do in the course of a day, it's best to look like the care of your trousers wasn't more than you could manage.
But then later on in the episode, they come together again, and Grace basically apologizes. She says, I was too rough on you earlier. You know, I got torn apart for the sin of ambition, and then you show up, the super trooper, good sport dream girl. And she kind of describes how she has had to evolve in her job. She says,
when I started out, I said I would never change myself for them. Now I get my hair dipped in carcinogens once a month. The eyeliner's a tattoo.
And they talk about how, like, women in these jobs have to behave differently. Kate brings up her husband, Hal, who she basically says, like, he's just failing up all the time. But that for Grace, that in the words of Kate, you're killing yourself and you're still on your way out, that the rules are just different for women. Talk me through how you thought about those conversations between Grace and Kate.
Well, we've certainly watched this play out a couple of times now in our national politics. So it was not a huge feat of imagination. Quite frankly, I was a big fan of Hillary Clinton. I was a big fan of Kamala Harris. And I had the privilege of speaking to people who worked on those campaigns and struggled to find the thing that was going to woo the American public. And it was never really the thing that you wanted it to be. It was about the haircut, or it was about the clothes, or it was about these things that ultimately aren't what we care about in head of state. But so much time and so much energy goes into the cultivation of them. And I certainly find that frustrating. And there's also, I think, a very good argument to not spend a ton of time worrying about the rules of the game that you're playing and just play it, which I think is the message that Grace ultimately comes through with. But it was very important to me to see Kate kind of fall in love with Grace and realize that there was this public persona that existed that is part of an ecosystem. It was part of, it's, built around the role that she was playing vis-a-vis the president and what that administration needed her to do. And discovering that Kate herself had kind of done the thing that she judges other people for doing, which is that she made a kind of a quick, glib assessment of who this person was, and then learned that this is like the mentor that she's always been searching for.
Well, I want to ask a more pointed question here, because you mentioned Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, having spoken to people who worked for both of those individuals. And I mean, I was really struck by the fact that, so I started watching season 2 right before the election, finished right after the election. And, seeing this character of the vice president, a woman who's trying to decide whether or not she's going to basically let herself be pushed out of this job, at the same time as watching, the first female vice president try and fail to become the president. Do you think that there is some fundamental truth about the challenges for women in politics, or the reasons why they sometimes aren't successful, that is represented in the story of Grace and in the show, that you think rings true to reality?
It's certainly something I'm grappling with. It's happened twice. When we were writing this, we had no idea that Harris would be the nominee. We had no idea that our story was going to look quite so similar to what was playing out. But it was devastating to watch it go down both times. And I don't know what the problem is. I don't want to believe that it's about, entrenched, centuries of misogyny that continues, and we believe that we've grown out of it, and in fact we haven't. I don't want to be in that world. It isn't how I experience the world, and I think for much of my life, I like to believe that my experience was representative, and I have come to accept the fact that it isn't representative, and that there are a lot of people who are, facing gender discrimination all day, every day, and that is perhaps the norm more than I want to accept that it is. Yes, there are a lot of other explanations for what went on in that election, but it's hard to drive around that one and dismiss it.
There's a term that I've seen used about the diplomat that you've talked about in the past, and I want to make it clear that I did not come up with this term, and I also have my boss's permission to cite it here, but it's competency porn. Essentially, yes. that in the Diplomat and in other shows like it, and The West Wing being a great example which you worked on earlier, is, the thrill of seeing people who are competent, who are generally smart and capable and usually well-meaning, doing their jobs. And I think that was a huge part of the appeal of The West Wing when it was first being aired, that this was the early 2000s. And a lot of people talk about how it was almost this like alternative reality for liberals during the Bush years, to imagine this world where people that they actually liked were running the country and doing things in a way that they wish the government was actually functioning, at that moment. I'm wondering if you think the Diplomat will have a similar dynamic going into this next presidency of people wanting to see like an alternative version of reality that's different than what I think a lot of people imagine the Trump administration will look like when it comes to diplomacy and interacting with the rest of the world and the ways that you try to prevent wars.
We know what we're doing for season 3, and it's written, it's being filmed. We don't know if the show continues, what the story will be, and I'm certainly spending a lot of time thinking about which way it could go, and should it be a wish fulfillment replacement for what's playing out, and should it not? I think the thing about competency porn that appealed to me was when I was working on the Hill as a child, the people that I encountered there and the people who came and spoke to us when we were on the West Wing, from either side of the aisle, I always thought, gosh, that person is unbelievably smart and well-informed and quick, and I like their values. I like the way that they think. It kept happening over and over and over and over. And at a certain point, I realized it wasn't just because I happened to be meeting the good guys. My feeling is that most of the people who go to work for the government are those people. And my feeling is that most of the people who are going to go and work for the Trump administration are those people. I think there are certainly corrupt politicians, venal, self-dealing politicians, and we know a bunch of their names, but most of the people who choose to go into this work do it because they want the world to be better for their children, for the children of strangers in their town and on the other side of the globe. I really believe that most people are doing that. And they're doing it in incremental ways that we don't really get. We don't understand what the levers are in those different buildings and those different departments of the government. And the ability to just have a little bit of a window into what one of those may be. There's certainly a lot of things that we're representing on The Diplomat that don't happen in every diplomat's office every single day of the year.
Sure.
But there's a lot of stuff that we are doing, that we are seeing these characters do, that do paint a picture of, what does it mean to, meaningfully move a relationship with another country one small step forward. Mm-hmm. So the government is a single word that's used to describe so many hundreds of thousands of people who are working really hard in jobs where they could probably make more money elsewhere. And it's important to me to paint a portrait of them and what they do so that we can separate the politicians we don't like from the notion of the country and the government that is hopefully helping it to be its better self.
Interesting. So it sounds like you almost see it as part of what you're trying to achieve here, that you're showing people how the government works, or at least like creating an image of this part of the government that like gives an insight, or in some ways like puts it in a positive light. Or I'm thinking about the way that the West Wing informed how so many Americans like imagine the White House or understand what the White House does, that something similar is happening here in terms of showing people like this is what a diplomat does. This is what people who work in an embassy in another country, like why they're there and what they're trying to achieve.
I would be delighted if a bunch of bright young people watched The Diplomat and went into the Foreign Service. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I do know that diplomats from this country and from other countries have come up to me and said, gosh, now my parents understand what I do, which I find delightful. It's not.
And I'm sure the realities of their everyday are exactly like this TV show in
like
terms
that.
of
Yes. Diplomats do not ever fly on private planes. It's very important to the Foreign Service that I make that clear. It was something that we depicted that is apparently extremely unusual. But it would be wonderful. The West Wing created a generation of people who went into public service. Grey's Anatomy quintupled the number of women that apply to and are accepted to surgical residency programs.
Interesting.
If it can have a little tiny crumb of that kind of influence, that would be lovely.
So coming back to this idea of what it means that there's going to be a new president, President-elect Trump, who is in some ways actively derisive, frankly, of some of the central tenets of diplomacy. I mean, there are so many examples of that in the past. President Trump, calling other countries, quote unquote, like shithole countries. Even more recently, there's been news about Trump kind of mocking Canada, calling Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau the governor of what Trump believes is going to be the 51st state of the U.S. and just being, diminishing to Canada or the Canadian government. What does it mean to you to be making this show at a time when a lot of people who work in the State Department are worried and in some cases fearful about what their work and what their mission will look like as diplomats under a Trump administration?
Yeah, I think a lot of us are worried, and certainly the State Department was really decimated in the first Trump administration. 30% of the budget was cut. A lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of people didn't lose their jobs. A lot of people kept working, and the dynamic that inspired me when I was just writing the pilot of the series was all these people go to work every day. They don't have to like the president. They don't have to like what the country has done. They don't have to like an individual policy that they're supposed to represent, but they still go out there every day and believe that there's some good that they can do regardless. And they work for any and every president. And that I find really inspiring. I think that it's really easy, when your candidate doesn't win, it's really easy to kind of dismiss the next 4 years and curl up in a ball in despair. And I certainly have done a bit of that myself. But I am very moved by the idea that you don't stop, you don't take a break, you continue to take small steps forward, even if there's a huge wave sort of pushing you way back out to sea.
Debora Cahn, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to talk to you.
Debora Cahn is the creator and executive producer of The Diplomat. That's it for Post Reports. This episode was produced and mixed by Rennie Svirnovsky with help from Peter Bresnan. It was edited by Maggie Penman. I hope you have a lovely rest of your weekend. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back on Monday with more stories from The Washington Post.